Just days after the chaotic Spanish Grand Prix sprint at Jerez, MotoGP officials have done something rare in the world of high-stakes racing. They have pushed through an immediate rule change. The decision lands just in time for this weekend's French Grand Prix at Le Mans, less than 2 weeks after the sport watched Marc Marquez turn what looked like a race-ending crash into a controversial victory. The sequence of events that forced this regulatory shift began when Marquez, sliding off his Ducati at the final corner on lap 8 of 12, found himself sprawled on the tarmac while the pack roared past. Instead of watching his sprint unravel, he picked up his machine, waited for the field to clear, then took a bizarre shortcut across the grass, cutting diagonally over the runoff area to reach the pit lane entry. He swapped to his wet-weather bike, rejoined the race, overtook Fermin Aldeguer and Francesco Bagnaia in the final laps, and took the checkered flag as if nothing unusual had happened. That victory did not sit well with everyone. Johann Zarco, who had started second on the grid and ended up outside the points after the weather chaos, was the most vocal. He told anyone who would listen that Marquez should not have been allowed to keep that win. Strangely, race direction did not open a formal investigation. The FIM reviewed the moment, declared that no regulation had been broken, and let the result stand. For 12 days, the result stayed on the books. Then, exactly a dozen days after the Jerez sprint, MotoGP dropped a rule change that effectively sealed the loophole Marquez had ridden straight through. The question is, why was he never penalized in the first place, and what does the new rule actually say? To understand why Marquez escaped punishment, you have to dig into the precise wording of the old pit entry rules and what was missing from them. The regulations at the time required any rider entering pit lane to cross the pit entry timing point at the mandatory 60 km/h speed limit. Marquez did that. He also needed to avoid riding over the green painted runoff areas that mark track limits. He did not touch that green paint, because the green section sat to the left of the pit entry, and he approached from the right via the grass. There is a rule about crossing white lines, but that rule applied specifically to pit exit, not pit entry. The pre-race notes for the Spanish Grand Prix did include an advisory saying riders must respect the solid white line on the inside of pit entry and exit to avoid cutting corners. But again, Marquez never crossed that inside line. He cut in from the outside, a path the written instructions did not expressly forbid. 3 other factors worked in his favor. First, he did not gain a net time advantage over other riders in a way the regulations define as illegal. Second, he waited for the pack to pass before moving again, so he did not endanger anyone. Third, no marshal at the crash site gave him a direct order, meaning he could not be accused of disobeying an instruction. Under the strict, literal reading of the rulebook, he was clean. Marquez himself was characteristically blunt when asked about it afterward. He said more or less, "Read the rules. They say if you don't gain time, don't create a dangerous situation, and don't cut a corner from the service road, you're within the rules." When reporters pressed him on whether he had known the exact regulations in the heat of the moment, he replied that he only knew 2 things for certain. You cannot start the bike on the track, and you cannot create a dangerous situation when you rejoin. Everything else, he implied, was fair game. The paddock split cleanly down the middle. Some praised Marquez for his encyclopedic knowledge of the rulebook, others accused him of exploiting a gap that should never have existed. Francesco Bagnaia notably defended him, saying no rules had been broken. Zarco, however, was unsparing. He said if there was no penalty, it was honestly very strange, and that Marquez had taken a massive risk, one that allowed him to pit a lap later than everyone else. "I think he shouldn't win this race," Zarco said, "because his decision was already made." That kind of direct, on-the-record criticism of race direction is almost unheard of in modern MotoGP. Then came the twist that made the whole affair even stranger. Italian commentator Guido Metta dug up an old version of the MotoGP regulations, one that had quietly disappeared from the rulebook in recent years. That old rule stated that entrance to pit lane must be made only through the deceleration lane or designated area, and that crossing white lines while entering was prohibited. Under that previous wording, Marquez's maneuver would have been illegal on its face. Journalist Simon Patterson, who helped bring attention to this discovery, admitted he could not understand why such a clear restriction had been removed. Somehow, years before the Jerez sprint, a rule existed that would have invalidated Marquez's victory. By 2026, that rule was gone. The result stood not because the sport had always allowed such shortcuts, but because an older, stricter provision had been erased from the books. That regulatory backstory is what finally forced MotoGP hand. The new rule, effective immediately from Le Mans onward, directly closes the specific path Marquez took. Any rider who now crosses the track in a similar way to reach pit entry, cutting across grass or runoff from the outside, will be considered in violation. While the exact penalty has not been uniformly specified across all sources, the precedent is clear. Race direction now has explicit grounds to investigate and penalize such moves in future flag-to-flag races. The change does 3 things. It acknowledges that the previous regulations had a genuine loophole. It brings the current rulebook back toward the older, stricter standard that had been lost. And it removes all ambiguity for riders heading into future changeable weather races at circuits like Mugello, Aragon, or Le Mans itself. For Marc Marquez personally, the Jerez sprint remains in the official record. His 12 championship points are locked in. The new rule cannot reach backward, yet the strategic implications for the rest of the season are meaningful. Marquez currently sits fifth in the championship with 57 points, trailing leader Marco Bezzecchi by 44 points. One of his sharpest tactical weapons, the ability to invent a creative pit entry in difficult conditions, has now been taken off the table. Future wet or dry races will force every rider to follow the conventional pit entry sequence, spending more time in that deceleration lane, taking on more risk of mid-entry crashes, and relying on old-fashioned strategy rather than regulatory ingenuity. The closing of the loophole is, in essence, a quiet return to an older, stricter racing culture. The speed of the response is notable. The Jerez sprint controversy erupted over one weekend. Within 12 days, the rule had been rewritten. That is genuinely fast regulatory action for any sport, let alone a global racing championship. It signals that the FIM is willing to make mid-season changes when an incident exposes a clear gap, and it raises the question of whether other holes in the rulebook might now be examined with the same urgency. The paddock has largely welcomed the clarity, though some privately wonder if the reaction was an overcorrection, a closing of a loophole that creative writers should have been allowed to keep open. For Marquez, the controversy has not dented his confidence heading into Le Mans. He was genuinely happy with the new Ducati development work done during the Monday test after Jerez, focusing on aerodynamic refinements with the factory engineering team. The bigger question now is whether he can translate that development direction into a clean, controversy-free weekend, especially given his ongoing shoulder issues and his recent crash record. The pit entry rule change has taken one strategic option away from him, but it has also given the entire field something just as valuable: regulatory clarity. What do you think? Was this rule change a fair, necessary response to the Jerez sprint, or did MotoGP overcorrect by shutting down a move that was technically legal at the time? Should Marc Marquez's sprint victory have been retroactively penalized, or was the result correct under the rules that existed that day? And given how quickly this loophole was found and closed, what other hidden gaps might still be lurking in the MotoGP rulebook, waiting for the right wet race to expose them? Drop your predictions in the comments. If this breakdown helped you make sense of the paddock politics and the fine print, smash that like button and subscribe for more MotoGP coverage. I'll catch you in the next one.